Watching Deadpool and Wolverine reminded me of this meme. The movie is obviously good, but it feels like a short-term win that'll have long-term consequences. Marvel movies fall into this unfair category where we can't just judge them on how they present themselves or how hard they make us laugh. We also have to consider what it means for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and if it sets the MCU up on a path for success in the future. So, in an attempt to be fair to this movie, I'm going to review it as a standalone product. But I do have a lot of thoughts on anchor beings and what those could mean for the MCU, so I'm going to make a separate video about that later in the week. Please like this video and subscribe if you want to see that, but before we get started, spoiler warning for literally everything. So, to review this movie, I want to talk about four main things: how funny the movie was, the cameos, the characters, and the plot. Maybe it's recency bias, but I do feel like this was the funniest Deadpool movie. The fact that Deadpool can take official jabs at the MCU now just makes his jokes hit so much harder. And honestly, the fact that Disney approved Deadpool saying that Wolverine joined the MCU at a low point is a classy move. In a world where Disney likes to control everything, they definitely had a genuine sense of humor with this one. And I especially appreciate this after the second Deadpool movie, where I felt like the jokes felt a little bit flat. Because in this one, there were only a few moments that missed the mark for me. Did we need 100 Deadpool variants for Deadpool to fight in the third act, only to become irrelevant when Peter walked on screen? No. But moments like this were fewer than I expected, and I was super happy with the end result. Especially knowing that Ryan Reynolds wasn't allowed to improvise on this movie because it was filmed during the writer's strike last year. As for the cameos in this movie, we all knew that this movie was going to feature probably more than any other Marvel movie. But I think they managed to somehow still exceed expectations in this area. Seeing Chris Evans back was fun, and seeing Henry Cavill as Wolverine was genuinely surprising. I didn't think they'd be able to get him for something like that. And side note, when Deadpool says how much better they would treat him than DC, I audibly cackled. I'm part of the Justice for Henry Cavill movement, and I hope his Warhammer franchise smashes expectations. Anyway, getting back to the movie, the real meat of the cameos came in the Borderlands to the Void, when Wade and Wolverine met Elektra, Blade, Gambit, and X-23. Any cameo can leak, and honestly, I wasn't too surprised seeing any of them on screen. But what I never expected from this movie in a million years was for it to be a love letter to the 20th Century Fox era of Marvel movies. I never thought that Disney or Marvel Studios would care that much about its legacy to give it its own movie to honor it. I unironically think that maybe the best part of the entire movie was the end credits, where they played Green Day's Good Riddance over the montage of 20th Century Fox behind-the-scenes footage. I got unexpectedly emotional during that, realizing that we'll never get films like that again. Superhero films that were still figuring themselves out. Superhero films that didn't know what they wanted to be. And even though it was unexpected, I'm glad Deadpool and Wolverine was the place to honor those movies. My favorite cameo is probably Blade's, because those movies get so overlooked nowadays. Plus, seeing a version of Blade on screen got me even more hyped for whenever Marvel Studios decides to make their version of Blade with Mahershala Ali. But moving on from cameos, I want to talk about the main characters of this movie. I'll start briefly on Deadpool, but I won't spend too much time here because he's basically exactly the character you expect him to be. Basically, Deadpool in this movie just wants to be a better version of himself to win Vanessa back. It's about as standard of a character motivation as you could ask for, and it basically allows him to do whatever he wants, as long as he ends up as the good guy at the end of the day. And I do feel like Deadpool had somewhat of an arc before he reaches the Time Ripper and decides to sacrifice himself. Because yes, in the beginning he is doing everything to win Vanessa back, but by the end he does care about the fate of his world beyond her. But I don't feel like it's anything that he didn't already learn from the first two Deadpool movies. His storyline feels a bit rinse and repeat, but I feel like they didn't want to give him too complex of a storyline because they wanted to shift the focus elsewhere in the movie. And that brings us to Wolverine. There were a lot of questions I had going into this movie about whether or not I thought having a variant Wolverine was a good idea. And after having seen the movie, I think the decision was made at the cost of having any real emotional impact. I think having any Wolverine is better than having no Wolverine, but did you really care about this version of him? Did his overly melodramatic backstory really hit you in the feels? I got to the point in the end where Wolverine is talking about being the one to sacrifice himself instead of Deadpool, and I was like, yep, that sounds about right. Go ahead and do it. Whereas, if this were the Wolverine that I grew up with, I would be screaming at the screen for him not to do it. It really felt like Wolverine was just kind of there to be there, and there wasn't any major reason that he needed to be included in this movie. And of course, while I can agree that it was better to have him than to not have him at all, can we just give him a little bit better of a backstory? He's labeled as the worst Wolverine, and they really hammer that point home. Was what he did really that bad? He says that the humans came and killed all of the X-Men when he was out at the bar drinking his sorrows. And like, sure, I'm sure you walk away from that situation with regrets, but it's not like you pulled the fucking trigger yourself. Mr. Paradox says what he did was unforgivable. Like, was it really? Unless he passed the human army marching toward the X-Men compound on the way to the bar, I think there's some argument for plausible deniability. Like, am I wrong on this? The counter-argument would be that Wolverine said that the X-Men called on him and that he walked away. It's pretty ambiguous as to what calling on him meant, so I wish they would have explained this a little better. Because that could be the difference between them calling him and being like, "Logan, come here, we're all dying, we need you." And, "Hey Logie, thinking of you, wanna hang out later?" I don't know. For how much this movie told me how bad he was, I didn't buy it. And because of all of this, I feel like his story was second to Deadpool's. I feel like this movie should have been called Deadpool with Wolverine instead of Deadpool and Wolverine. Saving Deadpool's world was monumentally more important than saving Wolverine's because we didn't know anything about it or care for any of its unseen characters. What I'm saying generally is that I think they could have handled having Wolverine in this movie a lot better, but despite it all, I'm still glad we got him. I did end up liking Cassandra Nova more than I thought I would, though. Yes, her villain is kind of another throwaway, but her acting was really compelling, and at least her rationale made sense. If someone like her was abandoned in the void and wasn't raised with the same upbringing as Charles Xavier, I'd totally buy her ending up the way she did. I also loved Tom Wambsgans from Succession. I mean, Mr. Paradox. I thought his character was super quirky and fun, and a perfect foil for someone like Deadpool. But I will use this character to lead us into the plot section, because while I loved watching him, his motivations are just borderline unexplained. This whole story, the entire quest he sends Deadpool on, arises because he wants to be the TVA. He wants to show the TVA how much more efficient they can be by pruning worlds more quickly instead of letting them burn out on their own. And my question is, why? It's left completely unexplained. And if I'm being generous, maybe that extra couple of thousand years creates more possibilities for things to go wrong for people that commit crimes against the timeline. But even then, that's a lot of assumptions. It's not like pruning worlds faster gets you a better score on your work performance evaluation. It just seems a little pointless. I love when plots feel natural, and in this movie it feels like they just kind of created a problem to solve it. And most of the time when I talk about things like this, people just say, hey, it's a Marvel movie, don't think too hard about it. To which I say, fuck you. Marvel movies have the capacity to be great, and they have been great in the past. I think it's so bogus how Marvel movies are just written off. They don't get nominated for Oscars, and they're just kind of viewed as lesser than. I think Endgame is one of the highest accomplishments in film history, and the fact that Robert Downey Jr. never got an Oscar nomination for Iron Man is a crime. So yes, please excuse me if my expectations for these movies are still a little bit high. I don't go into the theater expecting mediocrity, and neither should you. With that said, let me just go through a few of the random plot holes I identified watching this movie. Mr. Paradox says that Deadpool's anchor being died in his universe, but like, didn't the Logan movie take place in 2029? Deadpool hasn't reached that point on the timeline yet. Cassandra Nova had one of those sling rings that Doctor Strange uses, says she got it off of a wizard. If she can use it to get back to Earth, why didn't the wizard? In what world would have that wizard not used the sling ring the second they got pruned into the void? And why does Alioth just conveniently not attack them for the whole second half of the movie? I think there's a world in which all of these questions are forgivable. Endgame has plot holes as well, but the story there was so interesting that the little things just didn't seem to matter. In this movie, I just don't care about Deadpool's relationship struggles or Wolverine's home planet enough to justify the plot being anything less than airtight. So I definitely think that the plot is the weakest element of the movie. And I may sound harsh, but don't let that fool you. I still think the movie on its own was really good. Yes, I still expect a lot from Marvel Studios projects, even this late into the MCU's life cycle. But that doesn't mean that this movie wasn't a ton of fun. I make videos like an angry Yelp reviewer. Usually I just end up talking about all the bad stuff, even if there was a lot to love. Because while I can't forgive all of the things that were overlooked when crafting this movie, it still is pretty easy to push them to the side. You go to a Deadpool movie to laugh and go along for a ride, and they definitely accomplished that and more. So if I'm giving out a number score on this one, I'd have to give it at least an 8 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And remember that later this week, I'm going to be dropping a video all about MCU anchor beings. See you soon and have a good one.